It all started in the halls of Willow Creek High School, which buzzed with the usual teenage energy, a hum of laughter, gossip, and the occasional sound of lockers slamming shots. It was a typical school day, but there was something unsettling beneath the surface. A new undercurrent of tension that had arrived with the school's latest transfer student, Sandra. Sandra was unlike any other student. She moved with quiet grace, her steps light as if she were barely touching the ground. Her skin was an unusual shade, as if touched by a faint shimmer in certain lights, almost golden in the sun, and cool as stone in the shade. A most distinctive feature, though, was her eyes, deep green with pupils that seemed to narrow in the light, like a predator's. A few students had noticed this strange trait, and rumors were already spreading. Some said she had contact, while others whispered she was hiding something sinister. The whispers never reached her directly, but Sandra was keenly aware of the distance that had formed between her and her classmates. She didn't mind it. She had come to Willow Creek with one goal: to keep her true nature hidden. Her grandmother, the one person in the world who understood her, had warned her about the dangers of exposure. Sandra came from an ancient lineage, a bloodline touched by the spirit of snakes. It was the heritage that ran in a family passed down from mother to daughter, and Sandra had been the next in line to receive the gift, or curse as she sometimes thought of it. While she could blend in with humans, there was a part of her that was always curled, tense, waiting. Keeping that part hidden was both a survival instinct and a necessity. Her grandmother, the only one who knew the full truth, had raised her to move through the world, like a shadow, unseen and untouched. "Stay unnoticed, Sandra," her grandmother had said. "Let them think you are hard if they must, but don't let them see the truth," she added. At first, things were relatively smooth. Sandra kept to herself, sitting alone at lunch and focusing on her studies. She didn't make an effort to speak with others, and while some students cast her curious glances, no one seemed particularly inclined to reach out. That was until Sabrina noticed. Sabrina was everything Sandra wasn't: loud, confident, and obsessed with maintaining a position as the queen bee. With her stylish clothes, flawless air, and circle of friends that seemed to orbit her like planets around the sun, Sabrina was untouchable. She knew it, and she thrived on the control that she had over her peers. To Sabrina, Sandra was an oddity, a strange, quiet girl who didn't seem to understand the social rules that governed Willow Creek High School, and for that, Sabrina despised her. It started shortly at first, with Sabrina and her friends making snide remarks whenever Sandra walked by. "Is like so weird. Have you seen her eyes? Have you seen the color?" Sabrina would say, a voice just loud enough to be heard, setting up giggles from her friends. Sandra felt the stings of their words, but forced herself to remain calm. She had endured worse and would endure this too, but Sabrina wasn't one to leave things unfinished. She began to escalate her attacks, knocking Sandra's book from her hands as she passed in the hallways, sticking out with ridiculous nicknames like Lizard Girl or Creepy Sandra. Sandra tried to ignore it, focusing on her grandmother's words of caution. She knew that the anger simmering in her veins was dangerous, that it had the potential to awaken something that could not be easily controlled. Still, every time Sabrina stepped out, every mocking whisper, every look of disgust made it harder to keep her true self contained. One day Sabrina decided to make her disdain even more public. As Sandra was walking to her locker, Sabrina and her friends cornered her, blocking her. Sabrina's eyes sparkled with a cruel excitement, as though she had been waiting for this moment. "Hello, green eyes," Sabrina sneered, her voice dripping with mockery. "Where are your other cover members? Or do you slither alone?" Her friends burst into laughter, their voices sharp and piercing. Sandra felt her hands tighten around the straps of her backpack, her pulse quickening. She could feel the surge of something cold and ancient stirring within her, a presence that is softly urging her to let go, to transform into a snake figure. Sandra's expression remained calm, but inwardly she was struggling to keep her control. Her vision sharpened, and she was acutely aware of Sabrina's scent, the distant smell of perfume mingling with something else, something that a serpent instinct identified as fear masked by arrogance. She could see the quicking beats of Sabrina's pulse in her neck, the slight trembling of her fingers. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. Not yet. She thought, not yet. She wasn't ready to risk everything. Not over Sabrina, and not over something so petty. With one last look into Sabrina's eyes, Sandra stepped aside, moving past her and disappearing down the hallway. Sabrina and her friends continued to laugh, mocking her, but Sandra was already focused on something deeper. She could feel her inner self rippling beneath her skin, a quiet promise of what she could unleash if she truly wanted to, so she just had to walk away. As she walked away, she made a silent vow that if Sabrina pushed her too far, if her cruelty went beyond words and small acts of bullying, she would finally allow herself to strike. But for now she would bide her time, letting the tension coil within her, waiting for the moments when her patience would snap and her true nature would be revealed in the shadows. Sandra thought about the bullying. It didn't start suddenly, it built up over weeks. A quiet, insidious escalation that crept into Sandra's life like a poison. She could neither identify nor stop. Sabrina, the self-proclaimed queen bee of Willow Creek High School, was always But Sabrina's torment only grew worse. The whispers and casual bumps soon turned into something more calculated. Sabrina enlisted two of her closest friends, Kiki and Betty, who were more than happy to join in. They began to single Sandra out at lunch, sitting themselves near a table and accidentally spilling drinks nearby, sometimes drenching her books or clothes. One afternoon, Kiki even reached over and grabbed Sandra's notebook, holding it just out of her reach while she laughed. "What is the matter, ugly girl? Are you scared to beat me?" Kiki teased. Her tone dripping with mockery, Sandra felt a cold rage simmering within her, a tingling at the base of her spine that she recognized as a warning. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay composed. She couldn't afford to lose control, not now. She simply sat there letting Kiki and Betty laugh as they tore pages from her notebook. Sabrina watched from across the table, her expression smug, as if she were conducting the entire scene from a throne. Sabrina's next move was even more public. After a week of tormenting Sandra in the cafeteria and hallways, she orchestrated an incident in the science lab. Sandra was carefully setting up her materials for an experiment when Sabrina bumped into her, knocking the equipment to the floor. Glass shattered, chemicals spilled, and Sabrina faint shock, raising her voice for everyone to hear. "Sandra, can't you be more careful? Or are your skelly hands too clumsy for basic science?" she mocked. The other students laughed and Sandra clenched her fist, feeling the urge to strike. She could see Sabrina's smirk, the glimpse of triumph in her eyes, daring her to react. She forced herself to stay still, to keep her emotions in check, but her pulse was rising and she knew she was close to a breaking point. She could feel the familiar prickling sensation that signaled the transformation locking beneath her skin, ready to emerge. That evening, Sandra returned home in a silent rage, her body tense and her mind racing. Her grandmother noticed her sharp eyes catching the telltale signs, the narrowed pupils, the faint shimmer under Sandra's skin. She gently took Sandra's hands, her voice soft but firm. "You must not give in, Sandra. They are not worth it, I know, grandmother," Sandra replied, her voice a strained whisper. "But it is getting harder, they are pushing me." Her grandmother gave her a solemn look, nodding as if she understood. "Patience, my child," her grandmother said always. The next day, Sabrina upped her game once again, determined to humiliate Sandra in front of the entire school. She arranged for Kiki and Betty to sneak into Sandra's locker before classes started, where they stuffed it with crumpled paper covered in crude drawings of green-eyed lizards, and cruel insults scribbled in bright ink. "Lizard girl," "snake eyes," "creepy creature," and so on. When Sandra opened her locker, the papers stumbled out, scattering across the hallway floor. The other students laughed and pointed, some whispering in amusements, others openly mocking her. Sandra stared at the mess, a vision blurring as anger wheeled up inside of her. She felt something slitting just beneath her skin, a cold pulsing force urging her to release it, to let go and strike, but she held back, forcing herself to close her locker, carefully picking up the papers one by one with a strange measured grace. Sabrina watched from the crowd, her arms crossed, a self-satisfying smack playing on her lips. This was exactly the reaction she had wanted, a display of power over Sandra, a public humiliation that solidified her own dominance. But as Sandra gathered the last of the papers and straightened, she looked up, her eyes locking onto Sabrina's with an intensity that made the queen bee falter for just a moment. For the first time, Sabrina felt a strange shiver run down her spine, although she quickly shrugged it off. But Sandra's gaze lingered, unblinking, unflinching, a quiet warning that went unspoken. Sandra turned and walked away, but inside she felt something shift. She knew that patience could only stretch so far, that there would come a time when her restraints would snap, and when that moment arrived, Sabrina and her friends would finally see what they had been toying with. As she walked down the hallway, Sandra's hand brushed against her arm, feeling the faint scales that had started to emerge. She was starting to turn to a snake figure. The rain had cleared by afternoon, living behind damp, glistening pavements and puddles that reflected the grey sky. Sandra moved through the school's courtyard, her mind focused on her grandmother's words of caution and control. But the laughter that followed her wherever she went was particularly loud today, and she felt an uneasy sense of being watched. Just as she passed the fountain at the center of the schoolyard, she felt a hard shove from behind. She stumbled forward, her shoes splashing into a large puddle mud, flattering up her legs and onto her school bag. The laugh swelled and she turned. Sabrina was there, standing with her hand on her hip and a look of satisfaction on her face. "Look out, ugly girl," Sabrina taunted loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Wouldn't you want to get back into the mod where you belong?" A voice dripped with sarcasm, and our friends Kiki and Betty crackled in the lights, adding their own mocking comments as they circled her like vultures. Sandra pulled herself up, adjusted her bag and walked away without a word, ignoring the laughter that echoed behind her. She could feel their eyes on her as she She sank into the shadows, her body elongating, her skin cooling, her senses sharpening as she shared her human form. She moved silently, a serpentine body, gliding over the damp grass, her green eyes fixed on her target. Sabrina's back was to her, and Sandra's instinct took over, every fiber of her being focused on the strike. In one swift, precise movement, Sandra leapt forward, her fangs sinking into Sabrina's exposed ankle. The bite was quick and the venom took hold almost immediately. Sabrina let out a strangled cry, stumbling forward as she felt a sharp burning pain shoot up her leg. She whirled around, her eyes wide with panic, but saw nothing except empty air and shadows. The school grounds were silent. As Sabrina clutched her ankle, her breathing rapt, she looked down, spotting 2 puncture marks that began to swell, her skin around the bite turning a strange mottled shade. Confusion twisted across her face as the dizziness set in, a blurring slightly. She stumbled forward trying to call out, but her voice came out weak and strangled. Sandra had already vanished, shifting back into the shadows. Watching from a distance as Sabrina struggled to stand, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction as she observed the confusion and the fear that clouded Sabrina's face. It was the first time she had seen the girl shaking, stripped of her usual confidence, and it felt like a small silent victory. By the next morning, Sabrina was absent from school. Her friends whispered about how she had fallen mysteriously ill overnight, her legs swollen and feverish, the doctors at a loss to explain her symptoms. Rumors spread quickly, with students speculating that a poisonous snake might have gotten loose on campus. Others said it was a prank gone wrong, or that Sabrina was faking it to get attention. Sandra sat quietly in the back of the classroom, listening to the theory circulating around her. She maintained a usual calm expression, but inside she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The bite had been a warning, a reminder that she was not as helpless as Sabrina and her friends had assumed. She had her own ways of fighting back, ways that didn't require words or confrontation. Sabrina's absence cast a strange tension over the school. She had been the queen bee, the center of the social scene, and without her, Kiki and Betty struggled to keep the same confidence. They whispered to each other about her illness, glancing nervously over their shoulders as though the phantom snake might be lurking nearby. But as the days went on and Sabrina remained out of sight, Kiki and Betty seemed to forget their fear, slowly sleeping back into old habits. One afternoon, Sandra caught Kiki snickering as she passed by, nudging Betty and muttering, "Ugly girl. Can't be that scary if she just ran off." They laughed, trying to revive their confidence, and Sandra felt the familiar tingle of anger stirring within her. It was as if they were daring her, to remind her to show them just how wrong they were. She took a breath, steadying herself, allowing her thoughts to curl around an idea as she watched Kiki and Betty walk away oblivious. That evening, Sandra waited until the halls had emptied and only a few students lingered by the exits. Kiki, as always, was among the last to leave, lingering as she checked her phone by her locker. Sandra followed her, her footsteps silence, her form blending into the shadows as she let the change take over. She shredded her human form, slipping into a snake body, gliding along the floor in complete silence. Kiki was too absorbed in her phone to notice the subtle movements near her feet. The flash of green that slipped behind her. Sandra struck quickly, a fang finding Kiki's ankle with precise accuracy. Kiki gasped, clutching her legs as a sudden sharp pain blew them from the bite mark. She looked around wide-eyed and panicked, but there was no one there, nothing to explain the sting that spread like fire through our veins. The hall was empty. Sandra had already slid her back into the shadows, disappearing without a trace. The next morning, Kiki was missing from the class and the rumors intensified. 2 students, now both from the same friend group, had mysteriously fallen ill with identical symptoms: a burning fever, swelling, and strange bite marks on their ankles. Doctors remained baffled, unable to identify the cause. The students grew restless, and whispers of the phantom snake turned into a fearful, hushed conversation between classmates, their glances darting to every shadow as if expecting a serpent to strike at any moment. Betty, the last remaining friend in the trio, looked paler and more frightened by the day. She avoided walking alone, glancing over her shoulder constantly, her face drawn with tension. She sat at the back of the class, huddling in on herself, casting nervous glances all around. Sandra noticed, her expression calm but her eyes unblinking and calculating, as if assessing Betty from a distance. But Betty's fear didn't stop her from making a last desperate attempt to salvage her pride. One afternoon, perhaps embodied by the other students around her, she muttered to a nearby classmates, "Something is smelling. Can you perceive it too?" Betty held her nose as she insinuated that Sandra was smelling. The comment wasn't loud, but Sandra heard it clearly. She felt a cold satisfaction settled within her as she made a silent promise to herself that Betty would learn too, and she would learn the hard way. That evening, as Betty walked alone to the bus stop, Sandra trailed her, her body silent and fluid as she slipped into a serpent form. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the streets, and Betty's, obviously in a hurry to reach safety, didn't notice the faint rustle in the bushes side, her fang finding Betty's tie in the same swift, precise motion, delivering a final warning strike. Betty let out a strangled scream, clutching her tie as the same burning pain spread up from the bite mark. She looked around widely, but just like the others, she saw only shadows. By the next morning, the entire school was buzzing with the news. Betty was in the hospital with identical symptoms to Sabrina and Kiki. The gist had taken a life of their own, weaving through the school in panicked whispers. Some students claimed they had seen a snake in the school premises, others swore they had heard hissing sounds in the bathrooms or near the lockers. Sandra sat quietly in the back of her class, her gaze calm as she watched the fear grow. She had made her message clear. She was not someone to be toyed with. The bullies are all in the hospital writhing in pain, each one paying the price for their cruelty. Although they would never know who or what had truly been responsible, or so Sandra thought. Unknown to Sandra, Sabrina, Betty, and Kiki parents already met, trying to discuss what exactly would be the problem with their kids in the hospital. Especially because the 3 girls had the same symptoms and were not showing any signs of getting better. Also, Sandra didn't know that the last time she transformed into a snake form, Joker, one of the students in the junior class, saw her. While this was going on, the tension in the school settled into a low arm of paranoia. Students glanced nervously at the shadows, keeping their voices low as though afraid of waking some unseen creature. Will Sandra be exposed? Will the bullies get better, or will this all take a different turn? If you want part 2 of the story, kindly comment, "I want part 2" in the comment section. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.